Get started. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Dorothy Guzzo, the Executive Director of the New Jersey Historic Trust, and it's my signature you're going to find on all of your official grant documents. Congratulations to everybody out there. Your application, as you know, was successful. You've cleared the first hurdle, and we were successful in routing it through the legislative process, so yay for us too. The governor signed the appropriations bill in December, and we are good to go. Welcome to this workshop where you're going to learn absolutely everything you will need to know about managing your grant projects. We're using a webinar format, so you will only be able to see the images and the staff person who is doing the talking. And we will be reading questions, so please put any of your questions in the Q&A, and we'll be answering them at the end of each section for the benefit of everyone, unless it's very, very specific to your project, in which case we'll have an offline conversation. And we'll do our best to answer all of the questions that we can. By now, I think that everyone knows, you can do the next slide, who's ever doing that, advancing slides. Okay, that the Historic Trust is the primary funder of historic preservation in New Jersey. We're governed by a board of 15. I think we can flip to the next slide here. 3 of our members serve ex officio, and 12 are public members that are appointed by the governor. And in order to be appointed to the Historic Trust, they have to demonstrate experience in historic preservation. Next slide, please. As you'll see from the list, our staff is growing, and there are some new faces, and all will be needed. The Preserve New Jersey Historic Preservation Fund is funded through the corporate business tax dedication that's appropriated to Green Acres, Farmland Preservation, and to us for historic preservation projects. We are anticipating a robust amount of money each year for the foreseeable future, so that this additional staff is desperately needed to keep your projects on track. Next slide, please. So I'm going to now turn this over to Sam Siegel, who's going to give you an overview of the workshop for this afternoon. So again, welcome everybody. I wish I could say it was great to see you, but I can't see anybody. So have a good afternoon, and then we'll get to your questions.
Great, thanks so much, Dorothy. So my name is Sam Siegel. I'm a program officer here at the Trust. I'm going to give you a quick refresher on our webinar format, run through the workshop agenda, and give you an overview of the grant materials you've received so far. Next slide. So you'll see here the agenda for today's virtual workshop. As Dorothy mentioned, you should be able to see and hear the speakers, but we cannot see or hear you. We've also disabled the chat function, so you should pose your questions using the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen. I'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout the presentation and either respond to you in writing or assign the question to be answered live by our staff. If you see a question posed by someone else that you'd also like to hear answered, you can upvote the question by clicking on the little thumbs up button, and it will push the question higher in our queue. This is helpful for us to prioritize your questions, but as Dorothy mentioned, you should rest assured we will get to everyone's questions by the end of the webinar. If you're experiencing technical difficulties, you can reach out to us in the Q&A and we'll do our best to help. But please keep in mind, we are historians and not computer programmers. So getting back to the agenda, I will start with an overview summary of your grantee info packet and grant manual materials. Our fiscal officer, Carrie Hogan, will then walk you through the details of executing your grant agreement with the trust. And my colleague Haley will explain how we define the scope of work for your project. Glenn will explain the expectations for administering your active grant, as well as how to properly close out your grant when the project is complete. Ashley will discuss the importance of publicity for your project and highlight some opportunities that we have to help you with that. And then we'll make sure to answer everyone's Q&A questions before we hand it back to Dorothy to wrap us up. As I mentioned, I'll monitor the Q&A throughout the presentation, but we'll break for relevant questions after each section. Please be sure to keep your questions fairly general and relevant to the other participants in today's workshop, and be aware that we may leave your question until the end. If your question is highly project specific, we will ask you to reach out to the individual program officer assigned to your project. Our staff is always available for your questions after the fact, and we will make a recording of this presentation and a PDF of our slide deck available on our website for your reference. Next slide. Here you'll see a simplified explanation of our grant agreement execution process. Step 1 is to attend our mandatory grantee workshop to learn more about how to administer the grant. That is what you're tuned into right now. So congratulations, you're underway to completing your requirements. The next step will be to submit the supporting documentation in your grantee packet that you received from us a few weeks ago, which I'll explain further in a moment. You'll hear this repeated throughout the presentation, but please remember the grantee packet is not your grant agreement. This is just a submission of the final materials that we need to assemble your grant agreement and get it out to you for signature. We should receive your grantee packet materials by March 10th at the latest, so we can turn your grant agreement around in a timely fashion. Once we receive all of the required documentation from your packet, we will send you 2 hard copies of your grant agreement contract via certified mail. You will sign both copies of the agreement and then send them both back to us. From there, we will review the copies for completeness, and our executive director, Dorothy Guzzo, will sign them. After that, we will send them upstairs to DCA's fiscal office, which will conduct their own review and then complete the final signature. At that point, the agreement will be executed and all reporting, signage, and easement requirements will be in effect for your project. Glenn will cover these requirements later in the presentation. It's very important to note that we cannot process any reimbursement requests for your project until the grant agreement is fully executed. In addition to executing the grant agreement, there are some other requirements that might potentially apply before you can be reimbursed. So if you plan on initiating any work on your project before we execute your agreement, you should reach out directly to your assigned program officer to discuss the specifics of your situation. Next slide. So let's talk about the grantee packet, which we often call your grantee info packet or just your info packet. These packets were emailed to your primary project contact a few weeks ago, along with the invitation for this workshop. So you should all have a PDF copy of your grantee packet. We need these forms to be submitted in hard copy. So we ask that you please print out the packet in its entirety, fill it out, and submit it to us in the mail. Carrie will go into more detail about these required documents, and we ask that you please follow our instructions carefully so that everything moves smoothly. As I mentioned, the deadline for the grantee packet materials is Monday, March 10th, and we need to receive them as hard copies in the mail. Again, the sooner we receive your complete materials, the sooner we can get a grant agreement to you for signature and execution. The other document available to you at this point is the grant manual, which we now offer in a PDF format for ease of use. This manual is a step-by-step guide for every single aspect of administering your grant, beginning with preparing and submitting those grantee packet materials and ending with filling out your grant closeout paperwork. It also covers important initial requirements, such as our project sign specifications and bidding requirements. Please be sure to keep this grant manual handy, as it should be your go-to resource for this grant at every point along the way. Next slide. Now, we know that keeping track of a saved PDF or even a printed version of your manual can be tricky, even for the most organized amongst us. So we are thrilled to be able to offer the entire grant manual to you via our website, njht.org. This website was newly redesigned and it's finally gone live. Shout out to all of our staff members who worked hard on that project. So the new website is much more intuitive for you, but I do highly encourage you to bookmark our Grantee Resources webpage. You can find it by navigating to www.njht.org, clicking on the Resources tab, and then clicking on For Grantees. In addition to a PDF of the grant manual in its entirety, this Grantee Resources page also includes each of the reference attachments from the manual and includes important items such as copies of your reimbursement and reporting paperwork, a recording of this grantee workshop, and complete specs and templates for your required project sign, just as examples. So that concludes the overview and grantee resources. Haley, are there any questions we should address at this point before we launch into the explanation of the grant agreement? Oh, Haley, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So we have a few good questions. The first is from Clark. He asked if they could hand deliver their info packet to Trenton as opposed to dropping the hard copies in the mail.
Yes, you can definitely do that if preferable, and if that's how you want to get it to us by the deadline.
Great. Next is a question from Laura. She says, I have a grant manual from a prior year. Has there been significant changes that I should look for?
It depends on how you define significant changes. I would highly recommend you rely on the latest version of our grant manual because things do change. There's a lot that does not change, but it is definitely best to use the latest version if possible.
Yeah, I would second that, Sam. There haven't been major substantive changes, but the grant manual we released this year, in theory, should be kind of evergreen going forward. That's why we provided you with a link to the PDF in your email rather than a hard copy. That link will take you always to the most updated version. So when in doubt, please use the link on our website. It will be the most up-to-date grantee manual for you. Okay, and the last question is from Bill asking, will the slides be available to us after the meeting?
Absolutely. We will have a PDF copy of these slides available on that Grantee Resources webpage, as well as a recording of this workshop itself.
Great. And that's everything in the Q&A for now.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Carrie. I'm the fiscal officer for the trust and also the contract administrator. I'm going to go over the first couple of steps of executing your grant agreement. And you'll notice if you do have the grantee manual in front of you that the first couple of pages are really a step-by-step guide as to how to execute your grant agreement. So feel free to use that as your step-by-step guide for everything to ensure a smooth grant process. Next slide, please. So in the grantee packet are copies of the grant agreement forms that you'll need to submit to the trust to get the grant agreement going. You need to complete these forms and get them to your assigned program officer so they can create the grant agreement itself. Again, as Sam mentioned, these individual documents are not your grant agreement, but rather they're the forms that we use to create your grant agreement. So the faster you can get us these forms filled out and handed off to your trust PO, the faster your grant agreement can be generated for you. And the first form in your list is actually the checklist. And the checklist itself outlines all of the required forms that you will need. And the checklist with items on it need to be completed and returned as a part of your initial grant agreement package that's due early next month. Also in your packet is the letter of acceptance for your project. This letter needs to be signed in ink and returned with an original signature. Next slide, please. Next on the checklist is the information form or the info form. This form is critical to creating your grant agreement, and it needs to be filled out completely and accurately. It's a short form, but it has essential information. First and foremost, all grantees need to register with NJ START, which is the state's mandatory procurement and payment system. And when you register your organization, you will get a vendor number assigned to you. And you'll use that vendor number along with your EIN or employee identification number to create your profile, either for your organization or for your city, borough, municipality. Make sure, please, that all the information that you enter in your NJ START profile is correct. Any incorrect information can delay payments of your award. Again, this is the procurement system, so really any errors do affect you financially. I want to mention that most state, county, and municipal entities are already in the state's vendor system, probably via your EIN number, because you've probably been paid by the state in some form. However, it's best to contact NJ START directly to confirm that your address and contact information are all up to date. In particular, the address for your organization or entity in your NJ START profile should be a current mailing address or PO box that you can actually access and receive mail at. This is where your reimbursement checks will be directed. So we want to make sure that they are accurate and available. Another option through NJ Start is to sign up for automated or ACH payments. These are electronic payments that deposit grant reimbursement funds directly into your organization's bank account. So instead of waiting on a check to come in the mail, once a PO has approved your work and submitted to the fiscal department, your reimbursement money moves automatically to your business account. ACH can make your life a lot easier, and it can certainly expedite your grant reimbursement payments. Next slide, please. Sorry. Next on the checklist is proof of insurance. The grantee must maintain insurance for the entire term of the grant agreement and the full term of the easement if you have one, and many of you will have one. NJ Historic Trust must be named as additionally insured in the lower left-hand corner of your Accord liability certificate. Please request that the insurance company also add your project number to your certificate of insurance. That helps us track things more efficiently. All grantees must submit certificates of insurance and/or documentation of self-insurance to the trust before the grant agreement document can be created by your PO. You can contact your insurance company and get the certificate in place now if you want, and I recommend that. You do everything you can to get this in process sooner rather than later so that you're not waiting for the company to respond and send you a certificate. It's a relatively easy cert to check off this checklist, and I recommend that you address it sooner rather than later. Next slide, please. Next is attachment E, governing body board resolution. Your governing body, city, county, nonprofit board needs to pass a resolution that identifies by name the individual authorized to sign the grant agreement. In other words, the individual authorized in your attachment E resolution must be the same individual who will ultimately sign the grant agreement, and they must be named by name, not title. The resolution must have original signatures and be imprinted with a raised government, corporate, or notary seal or stamp. If your board secretary does not have an official stamp, you must take your resolution to a notary for certification. And in fact, most nonprofit, non-governmental organizations just go straight to the notary anyway, so that there's no question as to whether or not they've been properly certified. This is one of those requirements that you can get a jump on as well by getting your resolution on the agenda at your next board meeting or council meeting. Again, resolutions that are not properly certified and attested to will not be accepted, and your grant agreement process will be delayed. Next slide, please. Next is attachment G, statement of adequacy of accounting system. So this is for your CFO or your organization's treasurer, and they must review the requirements of the grant agreement, including state required audits and reporting, and then sign this form. Your CFO or treasurer cannot be the same person authorized by resolution to execute the grant agreement. It has to be two different people. This is to ensure that there are checks and balances built into the financial oversight of your award. Your CFO also certifies reimbursement requests and signs all payment vouchers. So you're going to need that person to be on board with the entire agreement. Once you have completed all forms in your grantee packet correctly, you'll then surface mail the entire packet to your program officer so that they can prepare your grant agreement. And as Sam mentioned, once prepared by your PO, 2 original copies of the grant agreement will be sent to you for signature. You'll return both copies to us. Upon return of both copies, Dorothy, our executive director, will sign them, and also DCA Fiscal will review and sign them as well. Lastly, 1 fully executed agreement will be mailed back to you for you to keep, and 1 will remain with the trust on file. And you're going to want to make sure that you really take good care of your grant agreement. Keep your copy safe and accessible. It's a living document full of useful tools and forms that will help you meet the requirements of your reporting and requesting reimbursement process. This is a state award, and those oversight steps are important. If you have any questions about the required material, please contact your program officer directly. Once you have your fully executed original copy of the grant agreement, that's when you can now request reimbursement for expenses. So we need to make sure that we have all of this accurately in place before we execute the grant agreement so that everything is a go for being reimbursed on your reward. And now I'll take some questions if there are any.
Yeah, we have a number of excellent, highly relevant questions. So the first question you addressed, but it bears repeating, is the raised seal still required? My county no longer uses the raised seal.
Right, that's a very good question. My understanding is that it's preferred, but if you have a stamp, that's fine. It just has to be something that officially certifies the resolution.
Great. The next question is about how to register for ACH payments.
It'll be an option through NJ Start. So if you already have a profile established in NJ Start and you have a vendor number, use your vendor number to go back into your profile, and you can request and set up your ACH transfer instead of having the checks mailed to you. Again, it's all done through a separate, this procurement system that's run by the Treasury office. So you'll want to contact them directly and see what your options are. That information is available to you on our website, in this packet, in the manual, and you can always call if you have questions.
Great. Another question is a little project specific, but it may be relevant. Do we need a certificate from the landlord property owner in addition to from the applicant?
I think Glenn's going to go over owner assurances. Is that right? I'm sorry. What's Glenn's looking funny?
Yeah, puzzled.
Right.
I mean, the grant is with you, the grantee, and the grantee is the one who has to provide the insurance certificate.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was assurance certificate. I misunderstood.
Insurance.
Yes. So
Right.
whoever is the organization, the city, whoever is on the actual grant agreement is the entity that needs to provide the certificate of liability insurance and add us as additionally insured. Sorry for the confusion.
No problem. Another question is, if I already have an insurance certificate in hand, can I just add the project number in ink?
If you already have the certificate insurance in hand, and if we're additionally insured, if it's just the project number, you can add just the project number, but you cannot add us as additionally insured in the Accord certificate in Penn. You would need a new certificate.
Right, you need to reach out to your insurance provider to do that for you. All right, the next question is, well, there are two related questions. One person asks, does the resolution need to have the exact language in attachment E, or can we modify it? And a related question is, do we have to use the format you provide for attachment G, or can we include what you require in the city's format?
The answer is that you can adapt either one of those documents as long as the final adaptation includes our language completely. So you can add what you need to satisfy the rules of your council, but they also have to include the language that we have and need to satisfy our council, as it were.
Great. The next question is similar. Similar to the insurance question, if a professional consultant such as an architect or engineer is involved, should their liability certificate be submitted as well?
No, we don't need everybody's certificates of liability. We just need the grantee organization certificate of liability.
Mm-hmm. The next question is the resolution due March 10th? The answer to that is yes. The entire packet, including the stamped material, is due March 10th. The next question is, does a non-government group need a corporate seal, or will the stamp of a notary suffice?
You'll want a stamp of the notary.
I think that covers it for now. Thank you.
Sure, great. Up next is Haley, who's going to talk about defining the scope of work for your project.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Haley McAlpine. I am a Senior Historic Preservation Specialist with the Trust, and today I'm going to talk to you about defining your scope of work. Next slide, please. Okay, so the scope of work for each of your grant agreements is going to be specific to each of your projects. We use something called the attachment D1 to define your scope of work. The D1 forms are actually included within your grant agreement, which, as Carrie and Sam have explained, your grant agreement is actually going to be your contract between the trust and the grantee organization for this project. So within that grant agreement, the D1 is going to contain all of your project specific information. All of this information is based on what you submitted with your grant application, because that is a project we agreed to fund. And your program officer is currently drafting or has already drafted your D1 and will be sending it to you for your review and approval. So please keep an eye out for that email. We'll need you to sign off on it. And as soon as we get your sign off on it and your info packet, we'll be able to move forward with the grant agreement. Next slide, please. So I'm going to walk you through exactly what's within that D1 document. Like I said, it contains all of your project specific information, including your project budget and your grant award amount. Your grant award is the dollar amount that was awarded to you from the trust to fund your project. The first major section of the D1 includes a brief history and significance statement, as well as a brief narrative statement describing the scope of work. The next section will identify your project review authority. The vast majority of you will see that the New Jersey Historic Trust is listed as the review authority. There may be a few projects out there where we will be coordinating with the Historic Preservation Office as the primary review authority, but by and large, it will be the trust. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out to your program officer, but it's not really something that the grantees are going to have to worry about. We will, on our end, determine who the review authority is. And the rest of the D1 is actually going to define very specifically the scope of work that we're funding. Next slide, please. So that scope of work is actually going to be broken out by construction division. So we will go through and list all the divisions, and all of the work items will be organized by those divisions. The D1 is also going to include your maximum non-construction budget. Non-construction costs for capital grants are capped at 20% of the total project budget. The way that the trust determines your total project budget is actually your grant award plus your minimum match requirement. So that number combined, and then we take 20% of that, and that is the maximum amount that would be allowed for non-construction costs. I do want to note that archaeology is not considered non-construction. You can actually loop that in with your construction budget down in the divisions. That way, it doesn't eat into that 20%. You can use that 20% towards true soft costs, and that way archaeology is not an afterthought, it's an integral part of your project. Speaking of archaeology, the D1 is also going to call out specific information for archaeology for your project. As you've been told before, any degree of ground disturbing work at all is going to trigger our requirement for archaeology. So there'll be some language in there specific to your project, but please keep in mind that archaeology is required. It is not optional if you are doing any level of ground disturbance at all. Okay, next slide. So I wanted to touch on project consultants. Your D1 scope of work form is going to identify if you have an architect on board or consultant on board. We'll include that language in there. It's important to note that all of the consultants that work on our projects do have to meet professional qualification standards, and all of the consultants on your project team have to be approved by the trust. So your program officer is actually going to sign off on your consultant team. Many of you had consultants on board when you applied for the grant. You included resumes and proposals. If you did include that information with your application, your consultant has been approved as part of our review process. For those of you that didn't have a consultant team on board when you applied, it's no problem at all. You're just going to work closely with your program officer to make sure that the consultants you're choosing do meet our qualification standards. So you'll need to submit resumes and proposals and get them approved. I should also note that some of you may have other professionals working on your project team, perhaps a heritage tourism consultant or a graphic designer. Those folks do need to be approved by the trust as well, and they do need to demonstrate relevant work experience and history with your type of project. So it is very important that all of the consultants are well qualified to take on this work. Next slide, please. The D1 is also going to contain your project schedule. All of the dates in the project schedule are based off of the date that the governor signs the appropriations bill, which for your grant round was December 21st, 2021. When we go to the next slide, I'm going to show you the actual project schedule for your grant round. But before we do that, I want to take a minute to define what these dates mean and what they'll mean for your project. So that agreement commencement date is the day the governor signs the bill. Again, that was December 21st, 2021. At that point, the floodgates are open. We're off to the races. The clock officially starts ticking. For most of you, your work period commencement date will be the same date as the agreement commencement date. However, we know that some of you have gotten started on your projects before the appropriations bill was signed. In that instance, we will actually use the day you started work. Then we have 18 months from that agreement commencement date to execute your grant agreement. Please don't take 18 months. It won't help you and it won't help us. The sooner that we get that info packet back from you and approval on your D1, the sooner we can get the grant agreement out to you for signature, back to us for signature, and then executed and open. So while we do have some time to execute the agreement, the sooner the better. Work actually must begin within 24 months of the agreement commencement date, and all work should be completed within 4 years of that commencement date. We do build in an extra year for the closeout process and any kind of like punch list items. So technically your grant agreement will expire 5 years from the agreement commencement date. And it is important to note that the trust board in the past had been somewhat lenient with extensions, but that is no longer the case. Extensions are granted in exceptional situations. So please work very hard to get your project done within 5 years and don't count on an extension because they are definitely not a given. You will have to go before the board to be considered for that. Next slide, please. So as promised, here is our specific schedule for this year's grant round. Again, December 21st, 2021 is kind of our start date. That is our agreement commencement date. And for most of us, that will also be our work period commencement date. Then you're going to have until June 21st of 2023 to execute that grant agreement, and until December 21st of 2025 to complete the work. And finally, your grant agreement is going to expire December 21st, 2026, which sounds very far away, but it will be here before you know it. So please keep that in mind as you're working towards completing your projects. Also, like I said, this specific schedule is going to be in each of your D1s in your grant agreement, so don't feel like you have to jot this down. And also, we're going to be posting the slides later this week, so it is there for your reference. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so in addition to that narrative D1 form that we just walked through, we also include the D1 expenditure spreadsheet. This is going to look very familiar to all of you. It's almost identical to the capital budget worksheet that you submitted with your grant application. So we use that as a guide to create the D1 expenditure spreadsheet. It identifies not only the construction division dollar amounts, but also the costs associated with all of your non-construction items. It also is going to include a column for match expended if your project is claiming any match expended. And I should note that this is going to align very closely, if not perfectly, with what you see in the application. But you may see when you get it from your PO that some of the values have been shifted around to account for some of our programmatic requirements, including the project sign and the permanent plaque, which we'll go into in more depth in later sections. If you have questions about this when you get it from your PO, feel free to reach out to them. Some folks had non-construction budgets that exceeded our maximum amount, so we had to shift values around. And it's important to note that we don't hold you to the dollar on these divisions when you submit reimbursements. They're basically just a guide for the project, but you're not going to be penalized if you go over in one division and under in another. They're just there as a reference point. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the D1. Before I hand it off, I do want to go over some programmatic requirements that we have for each of your projects. First and foremost, and arguably most importantly, is that all of the work that the trust funds has to comply with the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. Part of your program officer's job is to oversee the work and ensure that you are complying with the standards for your specific treatment approach. Next, as we've said before, and I promise we will say it again, archaeology is required for any capital project with ground disturbing work. Again, specific considerations will be included in your D1, but please keep that in the front of your mind as you move forward, that archaeology will be a discussion. And then finally, our grantees that are working with publicly owned resources, meaning buildings or properties that are owned by a municipality, county, or state, may be subject to project authorization from the Historic Preservation Office. It really is very project specific. It depends on the scope of your project and how much of the project we're funding, and things like that. So if you have questions about that, please reach out to your program officer. Okay, next slide. And finally, I wanted to touch on some state requirements. So in addition to the programmatic requirements, we also do have to comply with some New Jersey state requirements. Before I go into these sections, I do want to note that all of this information is in tab 3 of your grant manual. It goes into exhaustive detail. We get a lot of questions about these requirements, and all of the answers are in your grant manual. So it's really important that your CFO or your treasurer take some time to familiarize themselves with tab 3 and get an understanding of the financial and reporting obligations that come along with your grant funds. The first up is the audit requirement. So any of our grantees that are receiving over $100,000 in grant funds in a given year are required to submit an audit. Even if your New Jersey Historic Trust grant does not exceed $100,000, if you receive any other grants from the federal or state government that combined exceed $100,000, you are required to submit an audit. So please keep that in mind as you're looking at your fiscal budget from year to year. It's also important to note that audit costs are not reimbursable. You will have to budget for that separately. Next is affirmative action. So all of our grantees, their consultants and contractors are required to comply with New Jersey state affirmative action laws. It is especially important that when it comes down to contracts and public advertisements during the bidding process, that you include all of the non-discrimination language and policies in those documents. Your consultants are required to show proof of compliance to the state contract compliance unit through the Department of Treasury. So that's outside of our office. Your consultant will be working with them directly. And information about this is available on our website and in the grant manual. And when all else fails, you can actually reach out to the state contract compliance unit with specific questions about the affirmative action requirements. And finally, I wanted to touch on prevailing wage. Prevailing wage requirements only apply to grantees who are units of government or if the resource is owned by a unit of government. So for our nonprofit partners out there that may be working on municipally or county or state-owned resources, you will have to utilize prevailing wage. However, if you're a nonprofit grantee who's working on a building that's owned by the nonprofit, you will not have to utilize prevailing wage. So that's pretty much everything I have for this section. Sam, do we have any questions that I can answer before we move on?
We have a number of great questions. The first one is, how do we find out who our program officer is?
That is a great question. We had fully intended to tell you in the emails that you got, but we made a little bit of a flub. So if you have questions about your program officer, please email the NJHT email address, and we will get back to you with your program officer name and contact information.
Great. A question about the D1 is, what are considered non-construction costs?
So non-construction costs are going to be your soft costs, architectural services, materials testing, any kind of consultant fees that wouldn't be considered like bricks and mortar preservation. Things like overhead, contingency, and profit, those all go into the divisions, but things like construction drawings, architectural administration, like actually having them on the job site and running the project, those would be considered non-construction costs.
Great. And then we have a number of questions about the requirements. One question is, can you give us an idea of what would trigger the ground disturbance as an archaeology requirement? And does the trust provide a list of qualified archaeologists?
That is a good question. Pretty much anything that's going to involve ground disturbance, whether you're putting in a fence or excavating a foundation, anything where you're making
utilities.
Yes, utility trenches. You know, it could be something small as like, you know, a utility trench, or something as big as digging out a foundation. Those are going to trigger the requirements. And if you have questions about your specific project, I would defer to your program officer, because they're going to know the most about your project and how much archaeology you're going to need. In terms of maintaining a list, we certainly have the names of firms that have worked in our projects before, but we can't actually make any formal recommendations, but we could give you some names to get you going. There are several well-qualified firms and individual archaeologists in the state that can do this kind of work.
Very good. We have a question about the project timeline. What if your funding will not completely finish the project as it was proposed? Does the project still need to be done in the 5-year period, and could they reapply for more funding after the currently funded phase is completed?
Glenn, I will let you answer that one because that gets a little muddy.
So, I mean, again, the amount that the grant was based on, if it's a 50-50 grant, you're getting $50,000 or 100,000. I'm trying to make sure it works with the 60-40, 50-50. You get $200,000 from us. We're expecting a $400,000 project, and that's based on what you received the grant on. So if your question is you're not going to have the additional money to reach that $400,000, you cannot come back for another grant. You can't use a second grant to finish this project. So, but if you're talking more about, you know, our full restoration is going to be $1 million, but this project's only 400,000, then yes, that additional, we consider that kind of a separate project, a different phase. Then yes, you potentially could come back for another grant for that second phase, but considering what this grant is based on, you cannot come back for additional funds to finish that. That has to be part of this. And again, if there's an issue with maintaining that schedule, make sure your program officer is aware of that, and we'll try to work through that. And hopefully we don't need an extension, but you know, that's where something like that would come in play.
Right.
So anyone who has a question about that should reach out to their program officer directly.
Yeah. I wasn't sure if it was more of a question of, we have a much larger project overall that's in the, you know, which would be a separate phase, and that's, if you look at it as phases, then yes, you could fund the second phase, but not additional funding for the current phase.
And essentially, as long as the scope items we've agreed to fund are completed and you've hit that total project budget, meaning grant award and minimum match requirement, even if the big picture restoration isn't done, as long as, you know, let's say we agreed to fund the roof, as long as the roof is done within that timeline, we can close out the grant. But like Glenn said, we can't issue a second grant to complete the first one. You could certainly reapply for future funding for a different portion of the project, but with the grant, you need to make sure you're accomplishing all of our funded scope items and that you've hit at least the minimum total project budget.
Yeah, we also understand that construction costs have been just crazy over the past year. I know some things are coming down, but others are still going up. We understand that, and we'll work with you with regards to your approved scope of work and what actually can be done with the monies available. But again, that's why that budget is there. So if we see things going over in one category, we know to look at that. You know, do we have to adjust where perhaps another category, you know, doesn't get as much, and maybe that's not completed? But again, that's something you need to work out as you go along with your program officer.
Great. Another question we have is about the audit requirement. Someone asks, how do you define audit?
I can answer that. So we define audit by the state's definition of audit. So any subrecipient that receives $750,000 or more from New Jersey State or the federal government, combined or individually. It could be $750 from us or $750 combined with something from us, something from the feds. During one fiscal year, you must submit a single or program specific audit for that year. You guys will get letters for this if an audit is required. For those of you who are receiving any dollar amount over $100,000, you will be required to submit an audit. There's a yellow book audit is what it's called, and that's the government auditing standards. It's available also through the Treasury website, and that needs to be conducted for anything over $100,000, and a larger, sort of more comprehensive single audit is what's required for $750,000 or more. Again, these amounts are in your grant manual and also in your grant agreement. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out. These are also details that are outlined in OMB Circular 1508 that's available on the Treasury's website.
Carrie, just one, I guess, added thing is just, it has to be an outside firm conducting this audit. You can't, it can't be an internal audit. I mean, it's an actual audit firm, CPA or whatever, has to actually conduct this audit.
Yes, that's absolutely true. It can't be your CFO doing an internal audit. It has to be, you have to hire and build in the funds for an outside firm to come in and do an audit for your organization for this project. What is unclear, Bill is asking a question. You need an audit for any amount that you received over $100,000 in your fiscal year. You need a simple audit for anything that's between 100,000 and 750,000. And anything over 750,000 is going to require a more substantial audit.
Great. I think maybe if folks have more specific questions about the audit requirements, they can reach out to their program officer or directly to Carrie, and all of our contact information will be up at the end of the presentation. The final question about requirements is, do construction projects require the grantee to contact surrounding property owners to notify them about the upcoming work?
Our program has no requirement in terms of notifying folks. Being neighborly, probably not a bad idea. It's also good to get your community engaged. We want to make sure that everyone's supporting the project, but we don't have any requirements in terms of contacting your neighbors. So
those are all the questions.
Okay, great. Then I will hand this over to Glenn.
Thank you, Haley, Sam, Carrie, and everyone. I will be kind of going through quickly the administering of an active grant. Again, this is chapter 4 in your grant manual. As previously mentioned, this is accessed through the resources tab of our website. Please make use of that. Again, we're going through stuff relatively quickly. All that stuff is there in your grant manual, so you can take your time and go back and look at it. This is just probably just to give you a heads up as far as what you should be looking for. So also in the grant manual under this chapter, there'll be samples of pre-qualification forms. We'll talk about that later as far as contractors, as well as reporting and reimbursement forms. There's samples of all of those in the grant manual. Next slide, please. So communication with the trust, please. We get lonely, talk to us, email us. We're always available. There's no question is too small or irrelevant. We want you to be in contact with us. It's much better to address things early than wait and end up causing a larger problem that we could have avoided. So know your program officer, staff, contact information. Again, some of you were contacted, the staff was copied on the reminder for this workshop. Other program staff email directly. If you haven't, we will be reaching out to you, but our contact information is also located on our website and in the grant manual. Next, please. So when do you contact us? I mean, again, you're, well, maybe not constant communication with us, but always keeping us in mind. But typically with a construction project, there is actually more communication with the trust than say with a planning grant. So if you've received a planning grant from us in the past, I mean, things are kind of left over to your consultant to work on that planning document, and you come to us for a reimbursement a couple times, but otherwise you're sending us draft documents, but there's not as much communication. With a construction grant, there definitely is more opportunities and more need for communication with trust staff. So prior to construction, there still may be some planning documents to be submitted for review and approval by the trust. It could be a condition assessment, it could be a preservation plan, but more often than not, it's construction documents, basically plans and specifications that the trust need to review and approve prior to construction. Remember that all work, and Haley's mentioned this and others have as well, that all work needs to meet the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. Also, you will submit pre-qualification forms for review and approval. That's another time you'll reach out to the trust. You'll work with your program officer to develop that criteria, but you will be submitting that as well as accepted bid packages from your contractors. The pre-qualification aspect I will address in more detail a little bit later in my presentation. Also, if there are changes to the approved plans, or if you receive detail or cut sheets from your contractors, these should be sent to the trust for their review as well. Basically, anything not previously approved by the trust needs approval. So during construction, you'll invite us to project meetings and you'll send us meeting minutes. We may not be able to attend every meeting, so we heavily rely on those meeting minutes for us to review to make sure that, again, things are if there are issues are coming up that we could address, or again, making sure if we have concerns based on what's happening at the meetings, we could reach out to you to flag those earlier rather than later. So again, make sure that we're getting meeting minutes throughout the process. Next, please. Another thing that we require are quarterly reports. The report forms will be included as part of your grant agreement, but also digital versions of these quarterly reports and reimbursement forms are located through the resources tab of our website. So you'll have two ways of accessing that. Quarterly reports are required 4 times a year. Sorry for the obviousness there. By email if there's no reimbursement request, but if there is a reimbursement because of needing original signatures, you'll have to submit that by mail. Now the quarterly report asks about current status, project teams, various updates, stuff like that, as well as a project schedule. In addition to supporting a reimbursement request, these reports help us to determine if the grant project is on track and to understand the current status of the project. So they're very important for trust staff to receive. Even if there's been no activity or very little activity, please send a report or at least an email update to let us know where things stand. Again, communicate with your program officer. The last thing we want, the last thing you want, is to be denied a reimbursement request or have to redo construction work because you went ahead without trust approval on something, and either it was an ineligible expense or the work didn't meet the Secretary of Interior standards. So again, communicate with your program officer to make sure that we've approved everything as it moves along. Next slide, please. So the quarterly report itself, like the D1, which is attachment D of your grant agreement, the quarterly report is attachment C1 of your grant agreement. And the progress report, it's both the progress report as well as the reimbursement request. The progress report consists of the first 2 pages of the form, while the remainder pertains to reimbursements. The blank copies of these forms, again, are available through our website. Again, the C1 includes the following checklist items: a narrative describing what work has been done since your last report, provide your team list, the project schedule, if there's any specific submissions as part of your quarterly report, you would do it there, and the organization's project contact will basically sign off certifying that the report is accurate and complete. Again, these items, well, actually, the first 2 pages are important in that if you save a digital copy of that, you could use that as your starting point for future submissions. That way, you're basically just updating the one that you've already done. If anything changes, you could revise it versus from reinventing the wheel. So we highly suggest that that initial one, you definitely save a digital copy so that future submissions are easier for you. Again, if there's little report, then a quick email will usually suffice. But again, if it includes a reimbursement, we need a hard copy with original ink signatures. And again, the manual includes a copy of the completed quarterly report for reference, so you'll see exactly what level of detail we're looking for. And again, for reference sake, that's chapter 4 of the manual, is for administering the active grant as well as doing reimbursements. Speaking of reimbursements, next slide, please. So before we're able to provide a reimbursement, we need some of the following things completed. We need an executed grant agreement, so we can't do a reimbursement until we execute that grant agreement. Going back to, again, getting us those info packets back sooner rather than later so we could actually execute the grant agreement. You'll also have to install a project sign at the site. As you can see by the illustration there, it's a fairly hefty sign. And you'll also have to, if it applies to you, record an easement. Again, for the most part, and I'll go into easements as well as signage a little bit in greater detail in a minute or so. But again, for easements, it's typically it's a nonprofit organization that would require an easement. So each request for reimbursement must include all necessary documentation, which in our mind includes invoices, canceled checks, some sort of proof of payment. And again, I'll go into more detail in a second. During construction, requests should include additional documentation not already submitted, such as the meeting minutes, progress photos, change orders, that sort of thing. So again, that gets included in the document as well. At this point, I just want to remind people that these are reimbursement grants, which means that you need to expend funds before you get grant funds back from us. And again, the thing to keep in mind with this is that they're matching grants, so either 60-40 match or 50-50 match, which means that when you submit a reimbursement request, you'll be receiving a reimbursement of either 60% or 50% of the total amount that you spent during that period, minus 5% retainage that we hold until the end of the project. You'll receive the retainage when you close out the project. So this can be important, I know, especially to nonprofits, as a question of cash flow issues. So I guess one way to consider it is for a level 1 grant, which is up to $150,000. If you multiply the cost that you spent for that period by 0.57, that equals the amount of the check you're going to be getting back from us. So that's basically 60% of what you spent minus 5% of that part that we were paying that's held in retainage. If it's a level 2 grant, which means anything over $150,000, that multiplier is 0.475. So again, the money spent for that period times 0.475 equals the check that you'll be getting back from us. Again, from a cash flow standpoint, you're not going to be getting the full amount that you're submitting, because we're only paying our share, either 60 or 50% of the project. And ultimately, I guess you'll be showing us invoices and payments for the entire project cost, not just the trust share. So I guess keep that in mind as you're, again, thinking of a cash flow issue and moving forward with your project. For capital grants, you can submit reimbursements either quarterly, or if you need to do it more often, you can work out a schedule with your program officer. Oftentimes for construction projects, you're paying your contractors on a monthly basis. If you need to submit monthly reimbursements to us, that's doable. Again, what we don't want are reimbursements every month for $400, $500. I mean, they should be relatively substantial, because there is a lot of work that goes into it, both from our standpoint, you preparing the work, but also going up to our fiscal people up in DCA. So, but again, it doesn't have to be quarterly. Again, from a cash flow standpoint, it might be important to do it more regularly. You can work with your program officer to determine what that schedule is for you, what works best. Next slide, please. All reimbursements require a signed state transmittal and payment voucher. Again, this is another one of those documents that requires an actual ink signature to be sent into us. And this needs to be signed by your financial officer. The person that Carrie mentioned earlier on, the person who's actually signing that attachment G, is the person who should be signing both the payment and transmittal voucher, but also certifying that the amount being requested is the correct amount. Those are the two original ink signatures we need with all reimbursement requests. And again, no substitutions. We need this actual form to come back to us. In addition to these forms, you'll also include the invoices and copies of canceled checks or some sort of proof of payment for each of the invoices listed on the project ledger. Proof of payment could, again, besides a canceled check, could be a bank statement. We ask that payment should correspond with the amounts on the invoices. And to make processing faster, please group the correct invoice with the corresponding canceled check, so that we don't have to try to match things up. It'll just make the whole process go much smoother and faster. For agencies of government, when purchase orders are provided as proof of payment, they must be complete, fully signed by both parties, both the applicant as well as the government agency. If possible, please include the check numbers and amounts on those purchase orders, so for our references, so we could compare those to the invoices. Again, Chapter 4 of the manual includes an example of a completed reimbursement form that shows all these aspects of it. So please look at Chapter 4 again for that example. At a minimum, it'll take 2 to 3 weeks to process a reimbursement. and get a check out. I say a minimum now because our fiscal office upstairs staff has really gone. They've lost a lot of staff, and we're seeing that it's taking much longer to actually have them process the reimbursement. So expect at least 2 to 3 weeks, but it could be a little bit longer now until they get more up to speed with staffing. Next slide, please. Work product review. For capital projects, the primary documents submitted for review are construction documents, mainly plans and specifications. But all work products, again, must meet the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. And the trust needs to approve the documents prior to the start of construction. So again, just make sure that we've reviewed plans. If you've gotten started already, that a program officer has reviewed it already. We just don't want something to come back to us for reimbursement and we say, sorry, it doesn't meet the standards. So make sure that the trust is approving and reviewing all these documents before you start construction. And I know you've heard this already at least once, if not a couple of times today. If any of your projects include ground disturbing activities, then archaeology will be needed to take into consideration. So again, the sooner this is figured out, the better, so it does not hold up construction. Monitoring typically on its own is not sufficient, but that being said, you could have a phase 1 done on areas where you're going to be doing ground disturbing, and that archaeologists could determine that there's very low possibility of impact to archaeological artifacts, so it may end right there. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do a full excavation, but we do need to have an archaeologist, professional archaeologist, looking at the site to determine what level of effort needs to be done for archaeology when there will be ground disturbing activities. Other work product review are bid packages and qualification documents need to be reviewed by the trust, and I'll go into that a little bit more detail shortly. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier requires signage. So again, for capital grants, the construction sign must be installed prior to receiving a reimbursement and must remain up for the duration of the project. Again, so it has to be a fairly substantial sign to last 5 years if your construction job goes that far. The grant, through our website, both the grant manual as well as tabs within the website there includes the specs for the sign, including logos. That I know a lot of sign makers ask for our logo, so all that information is located through our website and can be basically given to your sign makers to do that. Again, all the specs are provided there on the website. For construction grants over $50,000, we require the installation of a permanent plaque prior to closing out the grant. Again, both signs are eligible expenses, but with regard to the permanent plaque, consider the design and manufacture earlier in the process because we can't close out the grant without that permanent plaque in place. And oftentimes we find that it's the contractor who's installing those permanent plaques. So again, make sure you're designing that early, getting approval from the trust on that design. That way you're all set to go and it doesn't hold up closing out your grant. The grant manual again provides the minimum language required for the permanent plaque. Oftentimes grantees will incorporate that language into a larger interpretive sign that they plan on putting on their site anyway. This is fantastic. We don't need a zillion different plaques and signs on your property. If you could consolidate into one interpretive sign, fantastic. So again, consider that as you're thinking about that permanent plaque if you have a grant of over $50,000. Next slide, please. Earlier, I mentioned easements. These are required for nonprofits with grant awards of over $50,000. These are term easements, which means that it's in effect for a certain number of years, and that's dependent upon the amount of grant that you receive. So you can see by the slide that if you received over 50,000 but under 100,000, it'll be a 15-year easement. For grants over 100 but under 450, it's 20-year easement, and any grant over 450,000 will require a 30-year easement. Some folks that have an existing easement because of a previous grant will do an easement amendment for those. Your program officer will reach out to you shortly. I think by the end of the week, I think we're going to be sending out some additional info that we need, basically kind of some deed information, perhaps some site plans that help us put together the easement. And that's important, that it's the trust staff who will actually generate this easement. You do not have to generate the easement, but you do have to record that easement. That is a grantee's responsibility, is to have it recorded with the county clerk. And that's up to you to pay for that as well, which typically runs between $200 and $300 to record a typical easement, and that's a non-reimbursable expense. But it's also important that easements must be recorded prior to receiving reimbursement. So again, we'll be working with you early on to get those easements generated and then recorded, so that that doesn't hold up any reimbursement process for you guys moving forward. Anyway, the easement is there to ensure that the resource is protected for that stipulated period of time, as a condition of, basically, watching out for state funds, being sent out. The reason it's only for nonprofits is that there are additional state laws in effect, the New Jersey Register Act, that requires agencies of government to basically go through the New Jersey Historic Preservation Office for approval prior to any work being done. So instead of being redundant, we deal with nonprofits, while the HPO is dealing with agencies of government. During the easement period, any project you propose that may affect the protected features that we outline in that easement must be reviewed by the Historic Trust to ensure that it meets the Secretary of Interior standards. Also, you are required to submit a brief annual easement report once the grant is closed and the easement is in effect. And you also need to maintain liability insurance for the term of that easement. So again, things to keep in mind as we're getting underway with this grant project. Next, please. Next thing I want to discuss are contractors and bidding. The trust requires the pre-qualification of contractors for all trust-funded projects. Pre-qual regulations help to ensure that a qualified and experienced contractor is working on your project. And again, only contractors that are pre-qualified will be allowed to bid on the project. Within the grant manual, there are sample regulations and the sample bidders qualification forms in the manual for you to look at. Now, you, often your consultant and your trust program officer, will work together to develop the criteria tailored to your specific project. But the basic information you'll see in the grant manual, that we need to follow for pre-qualifying contractors. Municipal and county government agencies will develop a very similar type of criteria, but they must follow a somewhat different procedure for pre-qualifying. This includes basically advertising and holding a governing body meeting to adopt a criteria that we've established. This process also includes review by the State Division of Local Government Services. So be sure to allot enough time for this process. The public meeting needs to be advertised at least 20 days in advance, and the Division of Local Government Services needs time to review these documents as well. So again, it does add a little bit of time frame to your schedule. But all construction contracts in excess of $100,000 must be publicly advertised, and the trust encourages public advertising with the goal of receiving multiple bids. So while you can solicit pre-qual packages directly from consultants, you'll also have to publicly advertise for those potential contractors as well. And again, only those contractors that have been determined qualified based on the criteria that we established will be able to bid on those projects. And you'll then have to take basically the lowest responsive bid from those qualified contractors. Next slide, please. Amending the grant agreement. There are certain times when a grant agreement needs to be amended. If a project is not on track, the grant agreement can be amended to allow you an opportunity to complete the project. If there is a change to the schedule for any reason, a change to the scope of work, or a change to the consultant or contractor, you must request that the grant agreement be amended to reflect those changes. This request is attachment D2 of the grant agreement, and it requires you to explain the reason for the change or delay. Again, hopefully this is not a surprise to your program officer that you've been working with, and they've been guiding you through this process as well. But the request will be reviewed by the Grants and Loans Committee at its quarterly meeting, and you will then be informed if the change has been accepted or not. There are times when delays are caused by circumstances beyond your control. We understand that, but to the fullest extent possible, you should make sure that your project stays on schedule. Getting an extension for your grant is not, getting an extension for your grant agreement is not guaranteed. the Trust Grants and Loans Committee will not automatically grant that extension. It will have to be fully justified. So remember also that your grant management history is part of your future grant application evaluation. So you want to make sure that you do your best to try to stay on schedule and not need one. But again, if the thing warrants it, that will be a consideration by our Grants and Loans Committee. Next slide, please. So closing out the grant, you've completed your project. All the work meets the Secretary of Interior standards, has been approved by your project officer at the trust. You've managed your grant responsibly. You've kept the trust in the loop with diligent quarterly reports, hint, hint, along the way. And you've beloved Historic Resources gotten all the attention that it needs. So let's close out this grant now. Next slide, please. Up until now, you've been using the C1 quarterly performance report for both reporting as well as reimbursements. The final report form is the C2 form of your grant agreement. And again, it can be accessed through our website as well as the grant agreement itself. You need to submit all invoices and proof of payment not previously submitted, showing that 100% of the total project budget has been billed and paid for in full. Again, these amounts should align with what was in your original scope of work in your consultant's contract. Your final reimbursement will be for the remaining balance of the grant, including the retainage the trust has been holding from your earlier reimbursement request. Next slide, please. So the final reimbursement report, the C2 form must include the following. Again, this is your final narrative. So whatever you're adding on to from previous narratives, you also need to include before and after photographs. A photograph of that permanent plaque that was actually installed at the site. Employment figures from both your consultant and contractor, meaning how many people were employed by both your consultants as well as contractors to complete this project. A revised scope of work if necessary, if things have changed, if things had to be altered based on discoveries perhaps during the project undertaking. The final project total project cost, again, especially if different from what was in the original application. As-built drawings, as well as a closeout letter from your consultant certifying that the project is complete. Keep in mind that some of these items should be collected throughout the project, such as photographs and maintaining as-built drawings. So it's good to raise these requirements early on with your contractor so that they don't say, oh, what do you mean you need before photographs as you're trying to close out the grant? So work with your contractor early on to make sure they're aware of what your requirements are for closing out the grant. And for them, for the most part, it tends to be both photographs, but also the as-built drawings that are needed. So once the final report and reimbursement requests have been approved by your PO at the trust, your final payment will be processed and your grant closed. Again, you'll be utilizing the same payment voucher that you used earlier, again, with the proper signatures. And again, that will have to come hard copy to us because of the signature aspect of it. Next slide, please. I don't believe there are any actual multi-phase projects in the 2021 grant round. If there were, basically you'd have to complete the initial phase work, close that out before you would start the next phase of work. So if you are coming in actually for a future multi-phase, keep that in mind that you do actually have to close out the initial grant agreement before you could start the second one. I think that was a record time. But again, all this information is in your project manual under Chapter 4. And I know we have a whole bunch of questions, I'm sure, so let's get into those.
We do have a number of great questions. To start with the questions about the reporting requirements, Clark Parks has an interesting question. Is there any problem with submitting the first quarterly report before April 15th? So I guess the question there is, how do you time your quarterly reports if you're not filing for any reimbursement?
Well, I mean, I think that the main aspect here is that we're getting 4 reports a year at a minimum. In the future, we hope to actually have a new database that will actually be utilizing these dates. So reminders will be going out using that. So I mean, try to to keep to these dates as much as possible. But I mean, if things are off a little bit, that's fine. But I mean, these will be kind of triggered to a future database, automatic mailings, reminders going out. So.
Mm-hmm. And then we have a question about whether the C1 needs to be mailed if it has been emailed. Do you want to reiterate our requirements for that?
The C1, the progress report itself can be emailed. What we need is if it's a reimbursement request, there are 2 places that we need actual ink signatures. One by both of them by your CFO, one indicating that they are saying that this is the correct amount that they're requesting. And the second one is for the transmittal and payment voucher that has to go up to DCA fiscal. Both of those need original ink signatures, so they have to come in the mail, but the rest of it can come in via email. It's nice if they're all packaged together, but we can do an email with the other part.
Great. So we had a question about the requirements for canceled checks. Is digital proof of a canceled check sufficient?
Yes.
Great. All right, so to get into questions about the requirements, when is it imperative to make sure that your program officer attends a meeting or a site visit?
We should always be aware of an upcoming meeting. Again, if there's something coming up like, oh, we know at this meeting there's going to be mock-ups for the brickwork that's being repointed, let us know stuff that we need to see in person. We'll definitely make an effort to be there. I mean, again, we're going to try to make it to to as many meetings as we can, but again, our time is limited, so we can't always get to every meeting. That's why it's important to make sure that we get hold of meeting minutes at all times. But again, we should always be aware of an upcoming meeting in advance so that we can try to plan for it if possible, or review what is going to be discussed at that meeting. So again, if we can't make it, perhaps we could say this is what you guys need to be looking out for, and this is what our concerns are, so it could still be discussed. And again, now I'm also seeing certain meetings being done virtually, so always invite us to a virtual meeting too. We can often participate that way.
Perfect. So we have a question about the project sign requirement. Does it need to stay up for the entire grant period, or can it be taken down after the project is completed?
Well, we don't mind advertising, so if it stays up a little bit after the grant, I mean, that's fine too. But at bare minimum, it has to be up before you receive a reimbursement, so that it should go up as soon as possible. But it has to stay up as long as the grant is still open, at a minimum.
Great. And then we have some questions about the pre-qualification and bidding requirements. Do they need to have a bid opening meeting of qualified bidders so everyone can see the low bid results?
We do not require that. I know some municipalities, some government agencies want a public opening. We do not require that.
Great. Regarding pre-qualification of contractors, if the property is government owned, but the grantee is a nonprofit organization, which pre-qualification approach should be used? That's somewhat project specific, but I
mean, if our grant is with the applicant, we don't require them to go through the other process. However, that being said, some agencies of government, because they own the property, require that to be done, just like prevailing wage is as a requirement because they're owned by the agency of government. So that you should check with the property owner, the agency of government, to see what their requirements are for bidding in that way. So, but again, we don't require it directly.
Great. And I guess if folks have any questions about which approach they need to use, they should reach out to their program officer.
Absolutely, and as well as just again, coming up with the pre-qual criteria, you'll be working directly with your program officer anyway. So at that point in time, yes, we could discuss in detail what is necessary for your particular project. What again, whether it has to be a public hearing, like a municipal government, or if it could just be done as through the nonprofit itself.
Very good. We have a couple of related questions about the closeout requirements. Someone asks, are only photos acceptable or can they submit short videos? Another person asks if the project manual provides, I think they mean the grant manual, whether it provides guidance on photographs, for example, the number, size, and what to photograph.
Haley, have we updated that to say we no longer need hard copies of photos? we
We
do
have-
accept digital photos nowadays, so.
Right. We have not updated it. We still accept the hard copies. I think they're good from a record keeping point of view because we do stay with the file for the full 20-year retention policy. But we do accept digital copies, and then you can send us more than, the 15 that would normally get printed out with the final report.
Yeah, it really depends on your particular project, what's being done. I mean, if it's a roof replacement, we don't need 15, showing each individual roof slate going up. So, I mean, depends on the complexity and how many photos, but it should represent, again, before and after, so we can see what work has been done.
Great. So we will leave a couple of these questions for the end of the presentation, but one more question is, are the as-built drawings reimbursable?
Yes, absolutely. That's well, I mean, for one thing, I mean, as-built drawings, typically your contractor is working with your architect. They've been provided with basically the actual plans to follow. And what they're doing is they're marking those up as they go along in case something changed a little bit. So those typically get redlined as built drawings. So it's a combination of the plans that your architect has supplied to your contractor and those markups that your contractor then provided. What we want is basically a record of exactly what was finally done, which isn't necessarily always shown by the original architect's drawings because changes were made in the field. So that's what the as-built is. And yes, that's a reimbursement request from both your architect, and that's part of your contractor's, frankly, overhead that they're completing as-built drawings. So that they'll be part of their contract with you anyway.
Great. We'll leave the rest for the end so we can move along. Oh, Ashley, you're still on mute.
Good afternoon. Many of you are still tuned in, so I wanted to begin by saying thank you for hanging in there. You have received a lot of information this afternoon, and we are in the home stretch now. So my name is Ashley Parker. I'm the Historic Preservation Specialist for Heritage Tourism at the Trust. Today, I will go over how publicity can play an important role in your project, along with ideas that you can use throughout your project. So publicity helps maintain visibility of your project and organization during the preservation campaign. It can increase attendance or membership for programs and activities, and can also attract new funding support and additional resources. Next slide, please. So publicizing your project also promotes and raises awareness of history and historic preservation in New Jersey. This helps ensure ongoing funding for historic preservation. So some good publicity opportunities are grant award announcements and check presentations, project milestones such as groundbreaking or ribbon cutting ceremonies, tours, special events, or profiles of your volunteers, staff, or special craftsmen. If you are interested in coordinating a check presentation or grant award announcement, please contact your program officer. We have a large check for presentations and are very eager to use it. As you can see from the images on the slides, those are just a few of our events from 2021. Next slide, please. So in addition, your site might also be eligible for inclusion on Journey Through Jersey, the state's go-to website for all things heritage tourism that was launched by the Trust in 2017. The website features heritage tourism destinations throughout the state, in addition to annual events, educational resources, blog posts, and travel itineraries, which are also featured on Journey Through Jersey's Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We highly encourage you to nominate your visitor-ready site. Journey Through Jersey will publicize your resource for free. We only ask that if you are participating resource, that you include the Journey Through Jersey logo with a link to the website on your organization's website. So if you would like to learn more about Journey Through Jersey, would like to be featured, or are interested in writing a blog post, please send a message to info@journeythroughjersey.com which is also on the slide in front of you. Next slide, please. So help us help you promote your project by staying in touch with us. The Trust is active on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So we encourage you to tag us in your posts, send us news coverage, progress photos, events, or any other content that you would like us to share. There are no guarantees, but we try to post as much as we can. We also kindly ask that you reshare our posts and link to our website in order to help us raise awareness about funding opportunities and historic preservation in New Jersey. Next slide, please. I would like to turn the presentation back over to my colleague Sam to address any additional questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I don't see any questions specific to publicity, but if folks have any, they should go ahead and drop them in the Q&A. Two other questions we have. One is about the D1 and sort of the challenging situation we've been facing lately with the construction industry and supply chain issues. We made mention earlier of working with grantees if material costs go over budget, if work requires a specific material, for example, copper, and it's or overly expensive. Is that a reasonable discussion or expectation to have flexibility within your scope of work?
Right. And I mean, I think, you know, when stuff like this comes up, whether it's through just your architect is seeing costs going up before you actually get bids back from contractors, or if it's actually bids back from contractors, typically at that point in time, you know, there's basically a meeting, you know, the architect, you know, the grantee, the trust, you know, are there alternatives to try to complete the work that needs to be done? So we have to look at what those alternatives might be. Again, all the stuff needs to meet the standards. We're not, you know, completely switching things off, but we have to look to see, you know, perhaps there is a different material that we could use that's acceptable. I don't know. Depends on a specific situation. I know right now, I actually just had a conversation with an architect a few days ago who actually is not putting anything out to bid right this second because prices are so high. So they're actually holding off a little bit, a month or something like that, to see if prices come down. So I think, you know, we'll work with you, but we have to, you know, how much is it over, and how does that affect the overall project? Are there alternatives that we can look at to still keep the project moving? Or does it get put on hold? Again, these are pretty extraordinary times as far as costs go. We understand that, but the whole idea is to again work with your professional, your historic architects, to determine in their opinion, what's the best way to move forward. And again, including the trust on those conversations.
Great, thank you, Glenn. I think that's really well said. We have not a question, but we have a return grantee who highly encourages their fellow grantees to do a big check presentation with the trust. We are so thrilled to be able to offer that. So we thank you for your interest. Here's another question about the audit requirement. When we speak about a needed audit, does that $100,000 threshold include grant monies we receive from other sources in addition to the trust, or is it only required if we receive more than $100,000 from this fund?
So I can answer that. It's a combination of state and federal assistance that brings you over that threshold. You don't need to account for private donations or other private grant resources that you've used. So it's just any money that you've received and spent from the state or federal governments.
Very good. So we have two questions here about publicity. The first one is, do you have samples of past publicity or ideas or examples for future publicity that you would recommend? And the other question is similar. It's have any current or past grant recipients developed educational materials or programs to engage children in their project?
So samples of past publicity, you can contact your project officer to coordinate with you. We oftentimes try to get some of our board members to appear at your event and or the Lieutenant Governor. Last year, for instance, we had events at the William Trent House, the Jackson Street Bridge, the Mercer Cemetery, the Battleship New Jersey. For instance, the Battleship New Jersey, they had news coverage for a news outlet in Philadelphia. We try to share it on social media. If you share it, it may be picked up by your local news outlet. Sometimes it appears on nj.gov. So there are various outlets. If you would like to discuss it further, please reach out to your program officer or myself directly. So in terms of educational programming, I don't think we've ever had anything specifically for historic preservation. However, we have had heritage tourism projects in the past that have come in to develop promotional materials. That, of course, is an eligible activity underneath the heritage tourism program. And you can, of course, engage with the community by doing workshops and such like that, which would also be an eligible activity.
Yeah,
I guess I would add to that too, Ashley, is, I mean, we always encourage our grantees. I mean, we want the public to understand that preservation just doesn't, you snap your fingers and it's done. So anything you could do to show them that this is a hard and lengthy and sometimes expensive process that you're going through to get to the finished product is always great. If anything from hard hat tours to other kind of exhibits that you might show, or think of it now for in the future. If you mentioned videotapes, I mean, videotape stuff being done so that in the future, you could actually show that to people coming to your historic site, that look what we had to go through in order to, come up with the preservation of this historic site. The one thing with regards to children, that it's not just for children, but I've seen it used incorporating, inviting children to participate. That's actually doing public archaeology at your site. I know a lot of the archaeologists in the state set up, have public archaeology. If they're doing, archaeology at your site, you'll advertise to bring public out, and they get the public involved with what they're finding, as well as even sifting through some of the artifacts that they're finding. So it's a great way to get actually kids, but the community at large involved and understand what's going on with your site. So that's one thing that I've definitely seen done with children, but adults as well.
That's great. Thank you, Glenn. So that looks like it's all of our questions for now. Before I hand it back over to Dorothy, I just want to thank everyone again for sticking with us for this long, dense presentation. As getting the grantee info packet back to us in a timely manner is your next priority. And obviously, reimbursements and reporting and closeout, all of this, won't be the freshest in your mind when you get to that stage. So we want to reiterate that manual is going to be really invaluable to you. You can revisit the recording of this workshop, and your program officer really is always available to you as a resource. You can call or email them at any time with any question, large or small. So with that, I'll give it back to you, Dorothy.
So I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. And I see that most of you have stuck with us. So I know we threw a lot of information out at you, but it'll all work, I promise. And we're looking forward to seeing all of these projects come to fruition. So hope you all are going to have a good afternoon for the rest of the day, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.